Kia ora koutou and good morning, everyone. How many countries do you think there are in the world today? Take a guess. Well, the precise number is disputed, but according to the United Nations, there are around 195 countries in the world. But according to FIFA, 211 countries are eligible for the World Cup. So if you guessed anywhere between 195 and 211, then well done. You've done enough for a Mallow-Puff. Today we continue our series in Deuteronomy, focusing on chapter 2, verses 1 to 22. In this passage, Moses sheds some light on God's governance of those nations who will be Israel's close neighbours. Last week, we heard how the Israelites failed to enter the land of Canaan and were sent back to wander in the wilderness for the better part of 40 years. Now it is the turn of the next generation of Israelites. Will they do better than their parents? From the end of Deuteronomy chapter 1, we pick up the story. This is Moses speaking to the Israelites on the edge of the land as their sojourn in the wilderness comes to an end. And so you stayed in Kadesh many days, all the time you spent there. Then we turned back and set out toward the wilderness along the route to the Red Sea, as the Lord had directed me. For a long time we made our way around the hill country of Seir. Then the Lord said to me, "You have made your way around this hill country long enough. Now turn north. Give the people these orders. You are about to pass through the territory of your relatives, the descendants of Esau, who live in Seir. They will be afraid of you, but be very careful. Do not provoke them to war, for I will not give you any of their land, not even enough to put your foot on. I have given Esau the hill country of Seir as his own. You are to pay them in silver for the food you eat and the water you drink. The Lord your God has blessed you in all the work of your hands. He has watched over your journey through this vast wilderness. These 40 years the Lord your God has been with you, and you have not lacked anything. So we went on past our relatives, the descendants of Esau, who live in Seir. We turned from the Arabah road, which comes up from Elath and Ezon-Geber, and travelled along the desert road of Moab. Then the Lord said to me, "Do not harass the Moabites or provoke them to war, for I will not give you any part of their land. I have given Ar to the descendants of Lot as a possession." The Emites used to live there, a people strong and numerous and as tall as the Anakites. Like the Anakites, they too were considered Rephites, but the Moabites called them Emites. Horites used to live in Seir, but the descendants of Esau drove them out. They destroyed the Horites from before them and settled in their place, just as Israel did in the land the Lord gave them as their possession. The Lord said, "Now get up and cross the Zered Valley." So we crossed the valley. 38 years passed from the time we left Kadesh Barnea until we crossed the Zered Valley. By then, that entire generation of fighting men had perished from the camp, as the Lord had sworn to them. The Lord's hand was against them until he had completely eliminated them from the camp. Now, when the last of these fighting men among the people had died, the Lord said to me, "Today you are to pass by the region of Moab at Ar. When you come to the Ammonites, do not harass them or provoke them to war, for I will not give you possession of any land belonging to the Ammonites. I have given it as a possession to the descendants of Lot." May the Spirit of Jesus illuminate God's word for us. It might not seem like it at first, but this passage is full of good news, mainly the good news of God's greatness, but also the good news of Israel's obedience of faith. First, let's consider God's greatness. In the 1870s, Thomas Bracken wrote the words of a poem called "God Defend New Zealand." This poem would later be set to music and become the national anthem of our country. The opening line in English begins with the words, God of nations. These three words pay homage to God's greatness. The Lord God is in fact sovereign over all the nations of the earth. That means God is in charge. God draws the boundary lines. He places peoples of different cultures where he decides. Thomas Bracken got this idea that the Lord Almighty is the God of all the nations of the world from Moses. In Deuteronomy 2, Moses traces the journey of the next generation of Israelites as they approach Canaan. On this occasion, the Lord instructed Israel to enter the land from the east. This meant traveling up through the nations of Edom, Moab, and Ammon. The Lord instructs the people to be very careful when passing through Edom and not to pick a fight. Treat the Edomites with respect because they are your brothers and sisters, and because the land they occupy was given to them by God. As it turned out, the Edomites were so afraid of the Israelites they wouldn't allow them through their heartland, and so Israel had to go around the outskirts of Edom. Likewise, when Israel came to the nations of Moab and Ammon, the Lord gave the Israelites the same instructions, to respect the Moabites and Ammonites, because he, the Lord, had given the Moabites and the Ammonites the land they occupied as their possession. The point which is repeated here is that the Lord Almighty is the God of nations. He isn't just the national God of Israel. Yahweh is greater than that. He rules over all the countries of the world, allocating land as he deems right. As we read in the New Testament book of Acts, from one man God made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. These verses tell us that God allocates land to various people groups at different times in history so that people will seek a relationship with him, so that humanity would come to understand that God is the ground of our being. Israel were not to try and take land given by God to others. They were to respect the boundaries the Lord had put in place and be content with the land God had provided. We also see something of the greatness of God's grace in Deuteronomy 2. The land of Edom was occupied by the descendants of Esau. Esau was the twin brother of Jacob, and the Israelites were the descendants of Jacob, so Edom and Israel were closely related. Even though Jacob was the one to inherit God's promise to Abraham, the Lord did not forget Esau, who sold his birthright for a bowl of stew. The Lord blessed Esau's descendants and made room for them too. In a similar vein, the Moabites and the Ammonites were the descendants of Abraham's nephew Lot. The Israelites were descended from Abraham, so that made Moab and Ammon part of Israel's family tree. Lot's sons, Moab and Ben-Ami, were conceived through incest. But in spite of this less than ideal start, God in his amazing grace blessed Lot's descendants and made room for them as well. You might be wondering, so what does this have to do with me? Well, the point of application is that God is greater than our mistakes. He is greater than our sin and selfishness. Do you have regrets over poor decisions you made in your youth, like Esau? That's no problem to God. He has the ability to redeem your regret and return it and turn it into something good. Do you have skeletons in your family closet, like Lot's family did? That's no problem to God. He has the ability to turn what you would rather hide into something good. In verses 20 to 22, Moses specifically says that God drove the Zamzamites out of the land of Ammon, just as he drove the Horites out of the land of Edom. Moses is underscoring the greatness of God's power and authority here. The Lord Almighty moves nations around the world like pieces on a chessboard. We might not always understand what's going on, but God knows what he's doing. You may remember from last week how the previous generation of Israelites failed to enter the land of promise because they were afraid of the people living there. These people were known by various names: Rephites, which means ghosts; Emites, which means terror; Anakites, which means giants; and Zamzamites, which means or refers to a threatening sound. With names like that, it's no wonder the Israelites were scared. For those of you who are familiar with Harry Potter, these people had a Voldemort-like reputation. Or if Stranger Things is more your style, then these people were like the Mind Splayer, filling the Israelites with fear and dread. Or if you are into Star Wars, then the Rephites, Emites, and Anakites were like Darth Vader and the Imperial Guards. Moses mentions their demise as a reassurance to the next generation of Israelites not to be afraid. Given that God drove the ghosts and the terrorists and the giants out to make room for the Edomites, the Moabites, and the Ammonites, then Israel do not need to be afraid. Again, you may ask, that's all good and well for Israel, but what has this got to do with me? Well, the point of application is that our God, the God of nations, is greater than your worst fears. So if God is for you, then you do not need to be afraid. There's one other aspect of God's greatness I want to draw your attention to in these verses from Deuteronomy 2. I'm not sure what to call it. Is it God's winsomeness? Is it his disinterested virtue? Is it his goodness and generosity? Is it steadfast love? Theologians might call it prevenient grace. Whatever adjective we give it, this quality of God's greatness is so subtle, so understated in the text, we could easily miss it. The Moabites did not worship Yahweh, the Lord Almighty. They worshipped a deity called Chemosh. Likewise, the Ammonites did not worship Yahweh either. They worshipped a deity called Milcom. And yet, even though the Moabites and the Ammonites were not loyal to Yahweh, the Lord Almighty, the God of nations, still fought on their behalf to give them their portion of land. What has this got to do with you? Well, God's action in helping a people who did not know him points to what Jesus did for us. In Romans 5, Paul writes, "You see, at just the right time, when we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. Very rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, though for a good person someone might possibly dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Since we have now been justified by his blood, how much more shall we be saved from God's wrath through him? For if, while we were God's enemies, we were reconciled to him through the death of his Son, how much more, having been reconciled, shall we be saved through his life?" We don't know the half of what God has done for us. Before we were even born, God was at work to provide for us, to care for us, and to save us. I don't know what the word for that is, but it speaks of God's greatness, the greatness of his love. There is so much good news in today's reading from Deuteronomy 2. While the main focus of the good news is the greatness of God, we must also acknowledge the good news of Israel's faith. According to the United Nations, the median age of the New Zealand population is currently between 38 and 39 years old, and increasing. By the year 2050, the median age is expected to be around 44 years old. Back in 1970, the median age was relatively low at around 25.6 years. To put that in context, the global median age has increased from 21 and a half years in 1970 to just over 30 years old today. About a quarter of the world's population is under the age of 14. In verse 14 of Deuteronomy 2, we read, 38 years passed from the time we left Kadesh Barnea until we crossed the Zered Valley. By then, that entire generation of fighting men had perished from the camp, as the Lord had sworn to them. That means by the time the Israelites passed through the nation of Moab, there would be no one older than 60 years of age, with the exception of Moses, Caleb, and Joshua. Most of the people would be under the age of 50. Very few would have any memory of the exodus from Egypt, much less the experience of being oppressed as slaves. Almost the entire population would know nothing except life in the desert. Pretty much everyone would have buried their parents in the wilderness. We don't know what the median age of the Israelites would have been at that time in history, but one would guess it was maybe around 20 years old, give or take. Pretty young in any case. The generation or time in history in which you are raised tends to have an influence in shaping the way you are. Generally speaking, people who were born around the same time are more likely to share similar experiences in life and to exhibit similar behaviours and attitudes. Sociologists have identified 4 generational archetypes which appear to repeat themselves over the course of a century. There is the hero generation, born between 1901 and 1924, also known as the GI generation or builders. These people lived through the Great Depression of the 1930s and fought in the Second World War. Then came the artist generation, born between 1925 and 1942, also known as the silent generation because they lived in the shadow of the hero generation. After that came the prophet generation, born between 1943 and 1960. We know them as baby boomers. Some of the prophet generation became hippies. The next generation, mainly children of the boomers, are the Nomad Generation, born between 1961 and 1981. These people are sometimes called Gen X, or the latchkey generation, because they grew up relying on themselves. In theory, the millennials, born between 1982 and 2002, start the cycle again as the new hero generation. The exact years for these generations are disputed. Different experts dice up the generations differently, so don't get hung up on the details and don't put too much weight on this. I share it with you today to illustrate the point that each generation is different from the one before. The new generation of Israelites that Moses is addressing in Deuteronomy 2 were different from their parents. The next generation had not been scarred in the same way by the experience of slavery in Egypt. They were not as afraid as their parents were. They had been raised in the wilderness as nomads. During their time in the wilderness, they learned to trust God because despite the difficult circumstances in which they were raised, they knew from personal experience that God has always been faithful in providing manna and quail and water. God had always looked after them. Now they were about to transition to a more settled existence with land of their own. Now they needed to be heroes in taking hold of God's promise. Verse 8 of Deuteronomy 2 appears quite unremarkable at first glance. Verse 8 reads, "So we went on past our relatives, the descendants of Esau, who live in Seir. We turned around the Arabah road, which comes from Elath and Ezon-Geber, and travelled along the desert road of Moab." On the face of it, this verse seems to simply describe Israel travelling by map, like in the movies when they show an airplane taking off and landing, or a ship sailing or a car driving. It moves the plot forward, but not much else. Nevertheless, what verse 8 implies is truly remarkable. This generation of Israelites obeyed God They were different to their parents. The Lord Yahweh told them to be careful and not attack the Edomites. And the Israelites trusted the Lord, doing exactly what he asked of them. This is what is known as the obedience of faith. Not doing what we think is best, but trusting God and doing what he asks, even if it doesn't make sense to us at the time. I imagine it must have been tempting for Israel to see an opportunity here and go for a land grab. Israel had the upper hand. They knew the Edomites were afraid of them. Israel could have taken advantage of Edom's fear and attacked, but they didn't. Israel showed restraint. Often we think of faith as doing something brave, and it can be that. More often, though, faith takes the form of exercising self-control and not doing anything stupid or selfish. Moving through the land of Edom, Moab, and Ammon without taking advantage of the locals was a test of faith that Israel passed. By obeying Yahweh in this way, Israel were demonstrating their faith in the Lord. They were effectively saying, "We believe that Yahweh is in charge. The Lord Almighty is God of nations, and he will provide land for us." This is next generation faith. This is good news. This is Israel doing justly, showing mercy, and walking humbly with God. Deuteronomy 2 touches on some sensitive issues for us, in particular the issue of land and who has the right to possess it. Disputes and wars to do with land in the Middle East have been simmering and boiling over for centuries. Every night we see glimpses of the war in Ukraine on our TVs and laptops. And we in the West are shocked and appalled that Russia thinks it is entitled to invade the Ukraine. Presumably, there are some in Russia who think they are taking back what was theirs in the first place. Here in New Zealand, we have our own history of land grabbing. Greedy, ruthless men in the 19th century who cared more about money than anything else dispossessed Māori of much of the land they occupied. But even before the European came, Māori were taking land from each other, iwi against iwi. While the Bible wants to affirm that the Lord Almighty is God of nations, and he alone has the right to determine who has possession of the land and where the boundary lines fall, the historical reality is that human beings, in their fear and greed and hubris, continue to transgress God's boundaries. I have no interest in passing judgment on who was right and who was wrong in disputes over land. I don't have the knowledge or the wisdom, much less the authority, to decide those sorts of matters. That's way above my pay grade. I'm just a pastor of a small church in a land that seems to be forgetting God. My job is to remind people of God and to help people understand the Bible, so we know how to relate with God and with our neighbours. I don't have all the answers. In fact, a lot of the time I'm just trying to figure out what the right question is. But this I know to be true. God is just and merciful. That means there will be a reckoning for those who transgress the boundaries that God puts in place. It also means that those who have been treated unjustly will be restored. In the meantime, we need to remember that Jesus is King. He is sovereign over all the earth. And one day every knee shall bow and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. Amen.